tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Every Monday, we like to check in with our friend Kris Sims of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. This is not a simulation. She is here in the flesh, well, virtually anyway. Kris, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for covering this.
You know, we cannot understate the importance of this. And you know, the CRTC can spruce it up as much as they want. They can talk about modernizing. They can talk about bolstering Canadian content. But at its core, not even incidentally, at its core, Bill C11 and the regulations that follow are about government manipulating what Canadians can see online, and by extension, what people can publish online.
Yes, and I think sometimes, because you've been in both, mainstream media for a long time, alternative media, and now what this is, I think those of us who've been in the game for this long sometimes don't realize that normal people don't realize how powerful the CRTC is. Okay. The CRTC regulates broadcasting. So think of your mainstream networks, things like CTV or CBC in some cases, global. That includes radio as well, by the way. And through doing that, if you run afoul of CRTC regulations as they interpret it, keep in mind, there's always an argument. If you run afoul of CRTC regulations and they get mad enough at you, they will pull your broadcasting license. And the sentence that concerned me most in this release that, as you rightly point out, was put out on a Friday before a government long weekend was online services that offer podcasts must register. So to your point, YouTube, Spotify, any of the others, Apple, any of the other online services that host a podcast like this one must now register. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Do they need to give the CRTC a list of all of the podcasts that are going to be there? And then after that, are all those podcasts monitored to see if they run afoul of any CRTC regulations? This is where we're getting to the crux of free expression. And this is why the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was fighting tooth and nail against C11. Because if you can't express yourself freely and air ideas that might be controversial or not in line with government narrative, it's impossible to hold your government to account. You have no voice. So this is why people outside of media really need to take this seriously. They gotta phone their MP.
Just to build off of your point, Kris, on the CRTC, you worked for Sun News Network, as I know a lot of our viewers will be well familiar with. And, you know, in the end, Sun News Network lives on in spirit through independent online media. We had Ezra Levant found The Rebel in the wake of it. We've had True North, which was founded by Candace Malcolm, who I know was also very involved in Sun. A lot of the personalities have popped up in all of these other fora. Sun News died in large part because of the CRTC, because the CRTC would not issue the same treatment that Sun News wanted that everyone else in media got in Canada. That was the issue. It wasn't that Sun wanted special treatment. It was that Sun wanted equal treatment. And just imagine the CRTC exercising that same level of judgment and latitude on online media services, where CBC Gem is going to get one treatment from CRTC in a way, and I don't know Rebel News' financials, but let's say Rebel makes $10 million a year or fits the criteria change, whatever. Is CBC Gem going to get the same shake from the CRTC as Rebel News? Absolutely not, because we know how CRTC has treated CBC versus Sun News.
Yes, exactly. And to give you an example, to your point, we were asking for what was called mandatory carriage, which wouldn't have incurred any cost to taxpayers, but it was a carriage service that the CRTC had given to all the other news networks. Okay, it had given it to CBC News World, as it was called back in the day, CTV News Channel, BNN, which is the Business News Network. All sorts of Canadian networks had been given mandatory carriage for years on end. Sun News Network had said, hey, we literally had our desks made in Calgary. All of our reporters are reporting from Canada. We even cover local elections, right, in Canada. We are Canadian, as you said before, as maple syrup. And they still said no. And we got shut down. And you run into this problem when you're dealing with government control of broadcasting. And I can hear some of the folks right now especially in government, saying, oh, well, safety, alluding to those things. I'm going to hit stop on that right now, because it is already illegal to distribute or talk about or promote horrific things like terrorism or keep the kids out of the room, images of child sex abuse. Okay? You cannot do that. Those are against the Criminal Code of Canada for a good reason. We are not talking about that. That would be an issue to take up with the Minister of Justice. No, C11 is the Minister of Heritage. This is about content and judgment of Canadian content. The issue here is a human being is judging what is and is not worthy Canadian content. And this is not a right or left issue. If I could just reach out to, as the late President Ronald Reagan used to say, our friends on the left. Imagine you're back in the early 2000s. Imagine that the United States is gearing up to invade Iraq. Remember then, back in Canada, a lot of the protests, Andrew, you might recall, were organized online. They were internet chat groups and blogs. It was before the days of podcasting, and they were all open. Everybody could read them. This was part of the open internet, and they formed massive protests against Canada's participation in that war. They had a huge protest on Parliament Hill, all organized online through communications. A few days later, then Prime Minister Chrétien stood up and said, you know what? We're sitting this one out. No thanks. Imagine if the government of the day found that to be problematic and didn't want that content promoted. What would have happened? Mm-hmm. So if you're fine with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's judgment of everything and you're one of those voters, okay, put your shoe on the other foot. Imagine if Pierre Poilievre were Prime Minister. Would you want his government dictating what you can and can't see online? You shouldn't.
I think you're right about that. And I would also talk about the unintended consequences here, or maybe intended. This actually came up in a housing context recently. So Italy as a country, for whatever reason, I don't know, has a policy of reciprocity where if an Italian citizen would be prohibited from buying property in a foreign country, someone from that country will be prohibited from buying property in Italy. And you take what's a very reasonable approach on its face. Italy's fine letting foreign investment run rampant in the country, but if your country is going to ban Italians from doing it, they're going to ban Canadians. And how I learned about this was because Canada has put in restrictions on foreign home ownership, and Italy is now looking at how to respond to that, I'm told. But just take that and put it into a content lens. Canada believes that we need to start basically restricting the inflow of foreign media content to Canada. That's their stated purpose. So that's not even like a conspiratorial thing. That's their deliberate reason. If I were a country that is wanting to export its media productions, why on earth would I ever want to import Canadian content in this? Well, if Canada is banning, Money Heist, which is a Spanish show, or Borgen, which is Denmark, and by banning, I mean restricting it and throttling it, why would those countries want to import Canadian content? So we're really taking this form of entertainment protectionism here, which Canada would never settle for if another country were to do it to us.
That's a great point. We could easily get into that sort of tit for tat war just on the cultural entertainment level. We're talking about, sitting back and chilling with Netflix for a little bit, as they say. When you talk about news content and information sharing, again, things get pretty twisted pretty fast. I'll give you a perfect example, and it's right within the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We call the carbon tax a carbon tax. We don't call it a fee. We don't call it a price on pollution or whatever else the government calls it. The government gets super mad at us for that. Like, they get really ornery over it. And especially when we point out that it's not reducing emissions and that people on average are paying out more than they get back. That's in direct contradiction to what the government message is. They've gone so far as to call it, I think they've called it misinformation. Don't think it's been disinformation so far. Do a thought process. Imagine then that they decide that misinformation is no longer allowed under CRTC content rules. Mm-hmm. Guess what? We can't have conversations about the carbon tax anymore then. Like, folks, this is really important. And if you don't care about the carbon tax, pick whatever issue is most important to you and apply that lens. This is why we need free expression in Canada. We need to be able to air out our issues, and we need to be able to talk to each other so we can organize and push back on government based on our topics. This is a major, major threat to that.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the misinformation aspect here, Kris, because I feel one of the most important aspects of this is that we can't look at all of the Liberal government's internet regulations in isolation. There's a whole suite of them that are being pushed through right now. We have C11 and C18, which have passed. We also have the Online Hate Act, which is going to be reintroduced at some point. And then there's going to be another online safety component, which may or may not be part of it, that I've been talking about. And we see examples of this in the UK and EU. So we know how the Canadian government is being informed and influenced. And as I've talked about on the show in the past, the most dangerous thing about this is that they're lumping all of these so-called online harms under one regulatory banner, which is just harm. And within that, they're having hate speech, misinformation, child pornography. And if you stand up and say, I don't like this, they're going to say, well, you're an apologist for child pornography. Like, that's going to be the debate. When we already have laws on that. And if we need to strengthen those, let's absolutely do it. But all of this is incredibly important. And I'm glad you brought it up, Kris, because the government is basically trying to extend its net to capture all of these outlets. The forced registration is not benign. It means that all of a sudden there's a designated contact person so that when all of these other things pass, they know who they have to talk to at each company to get content taken down.
Correct. And to your point, this could affect, based on what you were reading, this could affect the standalones, as you've described, if you're self-hosting. But also keep in mind, how much of a headache do you think these big guys, these big tech companies that do platform these podcasts, how much of a headache do you think they want? Like, do you really think that they want to put up with constant phone calls from the CRTC because they're giving like a relatively tiny Canadian voice, a tiny Canadian podcast? No, they just won't bother. Look at what's happened with C18. This is why when you go to Facebook, you can no longer post or paste a news link anymore. Because before, it was a fight between the government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and big tech. And big tech said, no, we are not going to pay media organizations based on links that are posted on our sharing platforms. Well, they called their bluff, and now they no longer allow those links to be posted because they don't want to pay that fee. Extrapolate this down the road and apply this new element that's coming out here with C11. And keep in mind, to your point, that this is not happening in isolation. So we've got all of this happening with online content, whether it's podcasts or whatever this would be called, an online show, whatever you want to call it, typically called alternative media. Okay, they're doing that. At the same time, the government is funding mainstream media now, and it's not just the CBC. Yes, the CBC gets more than $1.2 billion from taxpayers every year, so it is government-funded media. They're also paying mainstream media. And the last report we saw out of our great, good journalists out of Blacklock's Reporter, who do excellent work and have their own independent website, is that the mainstream media is looking to double its payment coming from the government. This is why journalists mustn't be paid by the government, because you can't hold somebody to account if you're counting on them for your paycheck. So this is happening on one side. They're going on to government payroll. And on the other side, in what we would call independent media, we're getting more and more severe restrictions.
Let's take that C18 comparison a step further if we can, Kris, because I agree, entirely predictable. I don't blame Meta for making the decision it made. I blame the government for, forcing it and not listening to them be honest about what they were going to do. The one silver lining for an independent media outlet like True North is that when Meta says we're going to ban links to your website, we still have our website. And we spend a lot of time and effort building up our own mailing list, telling our audience, please go to our website directly, join our email list so we can communicate with you directly. When we talk about what CRTC is doing, so those companies were offering a way to promote our content. The companies that the CRTC is going after under C11 are the companies that actually hold the content in some ways. So they're actually talking about websites where the podcast is hosted, which means there is no direct way for the consumer to circumvent that. Once they're gone, they're gone. And if some of these companies, like Rumble is a great example. Rumble has an ideological commitment to this. So I could understand them not wanting to play by Canada's rules and saying we are effectively blocking access to our platform in Canada. And if you're a Russell Brand or a Steven Crowder whose show lives on Rumble, boom, that show's gone.
Yes, exactly. And then what happens next? Right? I've noticed that they keep pushing more and more, like the goalposts keep moving farther down the field. So do a little thought experiment, and this is speculation, but it's based on observation of the government's behavior. And, I don't care what color jersey they're wearing. This is not a liberal conservative thing. I'm talking about the federal government that happens to be in charge right now. I'd be saying the exact same thing if this were a conservative government pulling this nonsense. So take that thought experiment an extra step. What happens then if they decide to go after self-generated, self-hosted content in a way that, hey, your server should no longer be hosting you because your server now needs to comply as a broadcaster under the CRTC? That is not that much of a jump away from a big podcast hosting website like Apple or YouTube.
Well, and that was the thing that happened with Parler. Now, I
Yes.
used Parler when it first launched and didn't really do much with it, but that was an outlet that ultimately was taken offline by its web host. And at that level of web host, I'm told there are only a handful of companies that even provide the service. So if all of them are playing ball with these government regulations, the government would have access to the kill switch.
Exactly. And so again, this is why. So for example, if want lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government, the way we do here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we do our own podcast. We put our podcasts out on all sorts of these platforms. Again, this is not even a thought experiment. It's come directly from the federal government. If the federal government decides that calling it a carbon tax and telling people the truth, saying on average, you're paying more than you get back from the government, if they decide that is now misinformation and no longer allowed, what then, folks? What then? And if the CTF isn't your cup of tea, pick whatever issue is important to you. If, for example, you're opposed to the gun grab, right? The seizure of lawfully owned firearms by law-abiding people, and they have their own podcast, but the government decides for whatever reason that they don't like it and it violates this certain list of rules. Again, this is where it becomes really problematic. And 100%, if you actually violate the criminal code in Canada, it doesn't matter if you're on a podcast, you're going to get in deep trouble, right? You're going to have to face a jury of your peers or a judge, etc. You wind up in the justice system. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about expression through the Canadian Heritage Ministry and through the CRTC, which is, again, why I strongly recommend people read Professor Michael Geist on this.
Mm-hmm.
He's a brilliant academic. He does deep dives and a lot of thinking on this. He's been in the room, apparently, when they've tried to discuss these topics, when they're drafting this legislation, so he can see where the puck is going. And in all honesty, contact like left-wing podcasts too. Say, folks, do you want to live under this kind of regulation coming from the federal government? Probably not. And link arms and defeat this stuff.
Yeah, and there have been some left of center groups that have been sounding the alarm on this, and I'm very glad for it, but I think we need a lot more. And basically, this is, I hate that old Niemöller quote that's like adapted to every stupid context, but first they came for the podcasters does seem appropriate here. Kris Sims, Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And I don't know if we've announced it, so maybe we can announce it now. You're going to be, are you coming to our event?
I'm not sure yet. I'm trying to.
Okay. Well, we hope to see you there. Either way, anyone should come to that event, October 21st, True North Nation in Calgary. Kris Sims, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.